The first time they called her a liar, the quiet sheriff was already standing there, his badge catching the afternoon light as if it were watching instead of him. And everyone noticed not what he did, but what he didn't do. Because the accusation came sharp and public, thrown at her like something already decided, and she stood in the center of the town square with her hands folded so tightly they shook, knowing that once a crowd agreed on a story, truth became irrelevant. Her name was spoken with contempt, then repeated with confidence, and each repetition made it heavier, as if saying it enough times could turn suspicion into fact, while the sheriff listened without expression, his jaw set, eyes steady, saying nothing as men leaned forward and women whispered that they had always known something was wrong with her. Someone laughed when she tried to explain herself, the sound slicing through what little composure she had left, and when she looked toward the law for help, she found only stillness, the kind that feels less like patience and more like abandonment. The townspeople took his silence as permission, mistaking restraint for agreement, and soon they were recounting details that had never happened, shaping lies so confidently that even she began to doubt the sound of her own memory, while the sheriff remained unmoving, hands clasped behind his back, absorbing every word as if storing them away instead of challenging them. He had heard lies before, had seen how quickly fear dressed itself as certainty, yet he also knew how fragile truth became once spoken too early, how easily it could be crushed by the very crowd that demanded it. And so he stayed silent as her voice broke and her shoulders sagged under the weight of being judged without defense. To the town, his quiet meant endorsement. To her, it felt like a verdict. And when someone finally said she should be run out before more damage was done, no one noticed the way the sheriff's fingers tightened slightly, the only sign that the noise around him was being measured rather than ignored. By the time she was pushed aside and the crowd began to disperse, the lie had already settled into place, solid and unquestioned, while the man sworn to uphold the truth remained exactly where he was, letting the town believe he had chosen their version over hers, even as the cost of that silence quietly began to take shape. By the next morning, the town no longer spoke of what had happened as a question, but as a settled matter, and her name moved through doorways and across counters with the confidence of something proven, while the quiet sheriff walked his usual route past the jail and the general store, aware that every step he took without correcting them hardened the lie a little more. People nodded to him as they passed, not seeking guidance but reassurance, and his silence gave it to them, allowing rumors to grow teeth and roots until even those who had not been present the day before repeated the story as if they had witnessed it themselves. She stayed inside the small room she rented at the edge of town, listening to voices drift past her window, each one sharpening the accusation. And though she knew the truth, the weight of collective certainty pressed so heavily that doubt began to creep into her chest, whispering that perhaps survival would mean leaving before the lie finished consuming what little place she had left. The sheriff heard it all, the embellishments, the convenient details added to make the story neater, more believable, and he did nothing to interrupt them, not because he agreed, but because he recognized the danger of speaking before the town was ready to hear something it did not want. Knowing from long experience that premature truth often died louder and faster than lies ever did. Still, each hour that passed tightened the line around her, turning suspicion into expectation, and expectation into punishment, until a shopkeeper refused her service, and a man she barely knew warned her that patience in a town like theirs had limits. When she crossed paths with the sheriff near the well, she did not ask him for help. Her eyes lowered as if the request itself would confirm the accusation, and that restraint hurt more than any shouted insult, because it told him she no longer believed silence could shelter her. The town took note of his continued calm and began to use it as proof, saying the law would not remain quiet if there were innocents to defend. And with every repetition, the sheriff felt the cost of his choice rising, aware that his position lent credibility to cruelty, even as he gathered pieces of truth others overlooked. That evening, as men gathered to discuss what should be done next, his name was invoked not as a voice of reason, but as an authority already in agreement. And though he stood apart, listening without comment, the realization settled heavily that his silence was no longer neutral. It had become the final confirmation the town needed, binding him to a judgment he had not yet spoken, and pushing the woman one step closer to losing everything before the truth had even found its shape. By the third day, the lie no longer needed voices to sustain it. It lived comfortably in glances, in doors that closed a moment too early, in the way conversation stopped when she entered a room, and the quiet sheriff felt its presence everywhere he went, a pressure that followed him through the town like dust that refused to settle. He reviewed what he knew in silence, the fragments others had dismissed because they were inconvenient, the timing that didn't align, the witness who had changed his account twice, the detail no liar ever forgot because it was lived and not invented, and still he said nothing, aware that the truth he carried was fragile, and that releasing it too soon would not save her, but destroy them both. The town mistook his restraint for certainty, growing bolder with each passing hour, and soon the talk shifted from whether she had lied to what punishment would restore order, as if cruelty were a civic duty rather than a choice. She sensed it too, the turn from accusation to consequence, and when she crossed his path again, she did not look at him this time, her shoulders squared in a way that suggested she had begun preparing herself for whatever came next. And that quiet acceptance unsettled him more than any plea could have. The sheriff understood then that his silence was no longer merely strategic. It had become a shield for the truth and a blade against her, and the balance between the two grew thinner with every breath he took without intervening. That night, he sat alone in his office, reviewing statements by lamplight, aware that each line of ink represented a choice he had already made. To wait, to endure the town's confidence in his quiet, to let them believe he stood with them when in truth he stood nowhere at all. Outside, voices gathered again, plans forming with the casual assurance of people who believed the law was already on their side, and the sheriff felt the first real tremor of consequence run through him. Not fear for his position, but recognition of what it would cost to correct them once they had committed themselves fully. He could stop it now, speak up, disrupt the momentum before it hardened further, but doing so would expose the truth while it was still incomplete, and he knew how quickly a crowd turned on those who challenged its certainty without offering something irrefutable in return. So he remained seated, hands flat on the desk, listening as the town's resolve sharpened outside his door. And in that moment of deliberate restraint, the quiet sheriff crossed a line he could no longer retreat from, choosing to carry the weight of their judgment a little longer, even as the cost of waiting began to shift from hers to his, binding his fate to the truth he had not yet spoken. The line was crossed not with a shout or a signature, but with a decision made quietly, and the sheriff felt it the instant the town acted without waiting for him, because restraint, once misunderstood long enough, invited others to move in its place. They gathered near the livery at midday, voices low but certain, discussing what should be done as if the matter had already been weighed and settled, and when they noticed him standing nearby, no one asked for guidance, assuming his continued silence meant consent. He listened as plans were spoken aloud with increasing ease, each suggestion more decisive than the last, and with every word, the truth he held felt heavier, no longer a shield, but a burden pressing against his ribs. Across the street she watched from the shade of a doorway, her expression calm in a way that suggested resignation rather than peace. And for the first time, he understood that silence had not protected her at all. It had trained her to expect abandonment. A man announced that order required action, that doubt was a weakness towns like theirs could not afford, and several heads turned toward the sheriff, not for approval, but for confirmation, which his stillness provided more effectively than any spoken word. In that moment, he realized that authority did not need to speak to shape outcomes. It only needed to refrain long enough for others to act as if it already had. He could feel the town tightening around its chosen story, transforming rumor into policy, and though his instincts urged him to intervene, he knew the truth was not yet ready to withstand their certainty, that without something unassailable, his words would be torn apart and used to strengthen the lie instead. Still, as the crowd dispersed to prepare for what came next, he felt a shift inside himself, an acknowledgement that waiting had consequences he could no longer pretend were temporary. When she passed him moments later, their eyes met briefly, and there was no accusation in hers, only a quiet understanding that whatever happened next would happen without help, and that realization struck him harder than anger ever could. Back in his office, he sat motionless, aware that his badge, meant to protect, had instead lent weight to cruelty, and that every hour of silence had bound him more tightly to an outcome he did not agree with, but had enabled. He reviewed the evidence again, tracing connections others had missed, and for the first time, he accepted that uncovering the full truth would not only clear her name, but unravel the town's confidence in its own judgment, a cost they would not forgive easily. As evening settled and preparations continued beyond his walls, the sheriff understood that his silence had reached its limit, not because the truth was finally complete, but because remaining quiet any longer would make him indistinguishable from those who had chosen certainty over justice. And whatever it would cost to speak later, it would now cost more to stay silent, binding his fate irrevocably to the truth he had delayed. By the time the sun rose again, the town's certainty had hardened into routine, and the sheriff felt the subtle but unmistakable change in how he was treated, not with suspicion but with expectation, as if his role had quietly evolved from guardian of order to quiet accomplice of consensus. People spoke more freely around him now, confident their version of events needed no correction, and with every careless remark, he measured how deeply the lie had rooted itself, recognizing that correcting it would require not only truth, but the willingness to dismantle what the town had already built upon it. He spent the morning revisiting statements, confirming timelines, and following the thin thread others had ignored, and though each piece brought the truth closer into focus, it also clarified what exposing it would cost, because the truth did not merely contradict the town's story, it implicated those who had repeated it with conviction. Word reached him that she had been asked to leave by the week's end, framed not as punishment, but as necessity, and the language used unsettled him most, the way cruelty disguised itself as order when repeated often enough. He saw her briefly near the edge of town, packing what little she owned, moving with the calm efficiency of someone who had already accepted loss. And for the first time, the sheriff felt the weight of his restraint settle squarely on his own shoulders, realizing that waiting had not preserved neutrality, but transferred the burden of injustice from the crowd to himself. When he returned to his office, a folded notice awaited him, unsigned but unmistakably deliberate, reminding him that the town expected unity in matters that threatened its stability. And though it made no demands outright, its meaning was clear enough to count as a warning. He understood then that the truth he carried would not simply clear one name, it would fracture the trust that allowed the town to function as it did, and those who benefited from that trust would not step aside quietly. As the afternoon wore on, he confirmed the final detail he needed, a fact so precise and unyielding it could not be dismissed without exposing deliberate deceit. And with it came the certainty that remaining silent any longer would make him complicit in something he could no longer justify as patience. Yet even with the truth assembled, he hesitated, not out of fear but because he saw clearly now what speaking would demand: the loss of position, respect, and the quiet authority he had maintained by choosing restraint over confrontation. As evening settled, he closed the file and locked it away, aware that the truth was finally ready, but that releasing it would exact a price the town had not yet imagined. And in that moment of clarity, the sheriff accepted that the cost was no longer hers alone to bear, because whatever happened next, the consequences would begin to fall on him, marking the end of silence as safety and the beginning of truth as sacrifice. The truth did not arrive with drama or relief, but with a quiet finality, settling into place as the sheriff compared one last account against the timeline he had reconstructed, realizing that what had been dismissed as inconsistency was in fact the only version that never changed, and that constancy, overlooked by everyone else, was the very thing that proved it real. He saw clearly now how the lie had been built, not by a single malicious act, but by a series of convenient assumptions, each one easier to accept than the discomfort of uncertainty. And he understood why the town had embraced it so readily, because admitting the truth would require acknowledging how willingly they had participated in its creation. With the facts aligned, he felt no triumph, only the steady weight of inevitability, because the truth he held did not promise resolution, only reckoning. And he knew that once spoken, it would not simply clear her name, but expose the town's appetite for certainty over fairness. He sought her out before the evening meeting, finding her at the edge of town, where the buildings thinned and the road stretched outward, her belongings packed beside her as if departure were already decided. And when he spoke to her for the first time since the accusations began, his voice carried none of the authority people expected from him, only the measured certainty of someone finally prepared to stand behind his words. He did not offer comfort or apology, knowing neither would change what had already been done. But he told her the truth plainly, explaining what he had found and what it meant. And though she listened without interruption, the shift in her expression revealed how deeply the lie had settled, how difficult it was to accept vindication after being conditioned to expect rejection. She did not ask why he had waited, and that omission struck him harder than any accusation, because it suggested she had already understood the cost of silence long before he had chosen to bear it himself. As he returned to town, the sheriff felt a resolve unlike anything his restraint had ever required, because speaking the truth would not demand patience but courage, the willingness to dismantle the certainty others relied on for comfort. The meeting gathered as expected, voices confident, plans already formed, and when his turn came to speak, he felt the room tighten, sensing that whatever he said would redefine not only the woman they had judged, but the man they believed him to be. He began without accusation, laying out the facts with deliberate precision, each detail chosen not to persuade, but to withstand scrutiny. And as the truth took shape in the open air, the first signs of doubt appeared, subtle and resistant, because certainty does not collapse easily. When he finished, the room was quiet in a way it had not been before, not with agreement, but with the uncomfortable awareness that the story they had trusted could no longer stand unchallenged. And in that silence, the sheriff understood that the truth had finally emerged, not as a weapon to punish the town, but as a mirror they would either face or break, and whichever they chose, it would no longer be without cost to him. The truth did not free him the way silence once had, and by the following morning the sheriff felt the cost of speaking settle into every interaction, subtle but unmistakable, as if the town had shifted its weight away from him without fully turning its back. Conversation stopped when he entered a room, not out of fear but recalibration, because he had disrupted something they relied on more than order: their certainty. No one challenged his facts outright, yet no one embraced them either, choosing instead the quieter resistance of distance, of waiting to see whether the discomfort he introduced would fade if ignored. Word spread quickly that he had overstepped, that by reopening the matter he had endangered the town's stability, and the same voices that once praised his restraint now questioned his judgment, framing his truth as a personal failure rather than a moral correction. He noticed how authority eroded not through confrontation, but through reassignment. How decisions he once made without question were quietly rerouted. How his presence became optional in matters where it had once been essential. She remained on the edge of town, her departure delayed but not cancelled, because while the truth had disrupted the lie, it had not yet dismantled its consequences, and the sheriff understood that vindication did not arrive all at once. It had to be insisted upon against a tide of convenience. When he spoke to her again, she did not express relief so much as cautious disbelief, explaining that the town's doubt felt less dangerous than its former certainty, because uncertainty at least left room for survival, and her words reinforced what he already knew, that restoring dignity required more than exposure. It demanded endurance. The town council convened in his absence, discussing his conduct in language carefully chosen to sound procedural rather than punitive, and when he was summoned later, the questions posed were not about the truth of his findings, but about his role in presenting them, as if the problem lay not in what had been done, but in who had dared to name it. He answered calmly, refusing to apologize for accuracy, and with each measured response, he felt the line between him and the town sharpen. By evening, a notice circulated announcing a temporary review of his position, framed as prudence rather than consequence, and though no one said it aloud, the message was clear enough to serve its purpose. Standing alone in his office, the sheriff reflected on how easily restraint had once preserved his standing, and how decisively truth dismantled it, realizing that the town could tolerate injustice more readily than disruption. Yet even as the weight of isolation pressed in, he recognized a quieter shift beneath the resistance, a hesitation in the way people repeated the old story, a reluctance to condemn with the same confidence as before. The lie no longer moved freely, and though the truth had not yet been embraced, it had begun to change the landscape. And in that slow, uneven transformation, the sheriff understood that losing everything he once held might be the only way to ensure the truth could no longer be dismissed as an inconvenience. The fracture did not come from outrage or confession, but from hesitation, the kind that crept into routine and made familiar judgments suddenly feel heavier than before. And the sheriff sensed it as he moved through town, not in what people said, but in what they no longer repeated with confidence. The story that had once passed effortlessly from mouth to mouth now stalled mid-sentence, interrupted by doubt no one wanted to claim as their own. And though no one apologized openly, the absence of certainty marked the first real shift since the accusation had begun. A witness quietly corrected himself when pressed on details he had once recited without thought. Another avoided repeating claims that no longer aligned with the facts laid bare, and slowly, without ceremony, the town's narrative began to lose its coherence. The sheriff watched it happen from the margins, no longer invited into deliberations, but still aware of how truth worked once introduced, not by conquering lies outright, but by making them difficult to sustain. She felt the change too, though it arrived unevenly, in the way some doors reopened while others remained closed, and in the cautious neutrality that replaced open hostility, a fragile improvement that did not yet resemble justice, but hinted at its possibility. When the council met again, the conversation shifted away from punishment toward reconsideration, not because compassion had emerged, but because certainty had dissolved enough to make consequences feel premature. And in that hesitation, the sheriff recognized the delayed effect of his sacrifice, understanding that truth rarely redeemed quickly, but often dismantled slowly. His position, however, continued to erode, as if the town needed a tangible cost to balance the disruption he had caused, and it became easier to question his authority than to confront the discomfort of admitting collective error. A formal decision followed, measured and carefully worded, announcing his removal pending further review, framed as administrative necessity rather than retaliation. And though the language was restrained, its impact was decisive. He accepted it without protest, aware that resistance would only allow the town to recast him as the problem rather than the mirror he had held up. And as he stepped away from the office that had once defined his place among them, he felt the weight of finality settle in, not as defeat, but as confirmation of what truth demanded. That evening, she approached him for the first time without hesitation, not to thank him or seek reassurance, but to acknowledge what his silence and eventual speech had cost. And in that quiet recognition, he understood that while the town had not yet fully reckoned with its actions, the lie no longer held her entirely, its authority weakened by doubt and time. As night approached and uncertainty lingered in the air, the sheriff realized that everything he had lost had been exchanged for something less visible but more enduring, the collapse of unquestioned certainty. And though the truth had not restored him, it had begun to reclaim her, signaling that the final reckoning, when it came, would not be loud or triumphant, but unmistakable. Without the sheriff's presence to absorb their confidence, the town found itself forced to confront the absence he left behind, and it unsettled them more than his words ever had, because certainty depended not only on agreement, but on authority that appeared unquestioned. The routines continued, but they lacked conviction now, decisions made cautiously, conversations revisited, and the story that once unified them began to feel like an accusation turned inward, exposing how easily they had accepted cruelty when it wore the language of order. She noticed the shift most clearly, not in grand gestures, but in the small corrections people made when speaking around her. The way her name was no longer paired automatically with condemnation, and though no one yet offered apology, the restraint itself marked a change, an unspoken acknowledgement that the lie no longer held its former power. The council convened again, not to judge her, but to address the fracture left behind. And in the absence of the man who had once embodied their confidence, they were forced to reckon with the truth without the comfort of displacement. Testimony was reconsidered, assumptions unraveled, and the facts the sheriff had laid out resurfaced with renewed weight, because without him to blame, the town had no convenient place to direct its discomfort. A decision followed, quieter than the accusation that had preceded it, clearing her name not with celebration but with formality, as if restraint could soften responsibility. And while the language avoided admission of wrongdoing, the outcome spoke clearly enough to matter. She received the notice without reaction, having learned that dignity did not require acknowledgement to exist, and when word spread, the town responded not with relief, but with a subdued silence that reflected its recognition of error more honestly than outrage ever could. The sheriff heard of it from a distance, no longer bound to the town's rhythms, and though the news confirmed what his sacrifice had made possible, it offered no restoration of what he had lost, because the truth he defended had demanded separation rather than reward. He did not return to claim vindication or recognition, understanding that his absence was part of the reckoning, a reminder of what it had cost to speak when silence was easier. For the town, his departure became inseparable from the cleared name they now carried uneasily, a constant measure of the price they had paid for certainty over fairness. And though no monument marked it, the lesson lingered in the way judgment slowed and voices softened. As the lie finally loosened its grip, replaced by an awareness that truth could not be summoned without consequence, the town faced its reflection at last. Not through punishment or spectacle, but through the enduring discomfort of knowing that justice had arrived only after it had cost someone everything. When the town finished correcting its record, it discovered there was nothing left to restore, because the truth, once spoken and paid for, did not circle back to reward the one who carried it, and the quiet sheriff remained absent not as a casualty, but as a choice, having understood that returning would only allow the town to believe the cost had been temporary. She stayed, not because the town suddenly felt like home, but because her name no longer needed to be defended. And in that quiet reclamation of dignity, she found something steadier than belonging: the freedom to exist without explanation. People adjusted around her, some awkward, some distant, a few tentative in their attempts at normalcy. And though no one offered a full apology, the absence of accusation marked a boundary she no longer had to fight for, allowing her to move through the town without carrying the weight of someone else's certainty. The sheriff's departure became a reference point spoken of carefully, often framed as an unfortunate outcome of difficult circumstances, yet everyone understood what it truly represented: a reminder that truth demanded more than agreement, that it required someone willing to stand alone long enough for others to see clearly. He settled elsewhere, his presence quieter without the badge, but no less resolute, carrying with him the knowledge that authority had never been the source of his strength, only his willingness to withhold judgment until certainty could no longer be faked. He did not speak of what happened, knowing the story no longer belonged to him, and that silence, unlike before, was now chosen without enabling harm. Back in the town, restraint took on a new meaning, not as permission but as caution, as people learned slowly that withholding certainty could be an act of responsibility rather than weakness, and that the absence of immediate judgment often preserved more than decisive cruelty ever could. She noticed it in small ways, in the pause before accusations formed, in the way questions replaced conclusions, and though the change was incomplete, it was real enough to matter. Time passed, and the story faded from conversation, not because it was forgotten, but because it no longer served the purpose it once had, and in its place remained a quieter lesson, carried in memory rather than rumor. The truth had not restored what was lost, but it had prevented the lie from claiming anything more, and in that limitation, it achieved its purpose. Somewhere beyond the town's edge, the sheriff lived without recognition, his sacrifice unmarked except by the absence he left behind. While within the town, a woman walked freely under her own name, unburdened at last by voices that no longer dared to define her. And though justice arrived without ceremony, and belonging came without comfort, the truth endured, not as a victory, but as a boundary that could not be crossed again without remembering exactly what it had once cost. If this story touched your spirit, share it so that the voices of the ancestors are never forgotten. Like and subscribe to Native American Tales, where every time we bring you another cinematic legend, where pain meets purpose,